There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Well, good morning, BookTube. I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel, and I think this might be my last al fresco Friday reads of 2021. It's a little chilly, although right at the moment I'm out of the wind, so walking here I was colder than I am now that I'm all set up. And yes, I have all the tripods and all the paraphernalia, all of the equipment that I need to do an outdoor Friday reads. And my list of things to talk about is 2 pages long, so I'm not going to dilly-dally. The first thing I want to talk about is Roz of Scally-Dandling About the Books. Very much in my thoughts today. She has not only given me permission to talk about her, but also told me what to say, as is her wont. Sadly, Roz and her entire household have tested positive for COVID this week, and the entire household was fully vaccinated, and they all have COVID. Most of them are doing very, very well with kind of mild flu-like symptoms, resting at home. And she wanted me to pass on this news as a way of getting a message out to everybody to be careful. They don't know how they got it, and they've been very, very careful, but we all need to be very careful. Even more than that, just sending... I think Roz might not do big gay hugs, but I'm sending her big gay hugs from Tokyo, and you should send her big hugs of whatever sexual orientation you wish. That will cheer her up. I'm sure she'll be back on BookTube telling us all about it in her own words, but this is kind of a message from Roz, and also my message to Roz, that wishing her all the best. My goodness. I think I'm going to be fighting with the sun. It's 7:30, and I forgot that this park is actually optimal in terms of not having to fight the sun by around 9 a.m. So I may be having to move around. I got 2 benches and a tree, and I think the sun is going to move, and I might have to shift over to the other bench, and I've got this thing, this clamp thing I got to screw and unscrew, and it's going to get a sore wrist. Anyway, don't usually get a sore wrist from screwing. Let's talk about the Booker. So, I was delighted that Damon Galgut won for The Promise. It was the best book, I think, but I also loved Anouk Erid-Pergassim's The Passage North. I think they were pretty much equal in my mind. I would have been delighted with either of them. Otherwise, it was a very weak list. I am still reading, is it Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, and I'm very much enjoying it. It's not going to rise to the level of the 2 I've just mentioned, but it's really holding my interest. So I didn't quite get the shortlist read in time for the winner to be announced, but I got very close because I bailed on half of the shortlist. And all in all, I was disappointed. I didn't enjoy the experience of reading the long list. I have about 4 books from the long list that weren't shortlisted, and I don't want to think about them, look at them, even certainly not read them until next year, but I will honor that commitment. And I'm sure a couple of those are going to be insta-bails as well. But it was a really good experience in that it showed me how much I hate reading books at the same time that half or 3/4 of BookTube are reading them. I absolutely hate it. I would rather just sit back and enjoy all of that as a spectator and not read those books until 7 years have gone by. My whole thing with new releases is not all new releases, but hyped new releases, popular new releases. I don't mean popular. The books that are popular are the shittiest ones, and I wouldn't touch them. But, in terms of literary fiction, the books that there's a lot of buzz about, I either want to be one of the early readers, like I was with Sally Rooney's latest one, or I don't want to touch it for years. And the Booker, honoring my commitment to read the Booker, showed me that, I have to respect my own reading personality. I would much rather just watch Kieran's videos and Eric's videos and Bob the Booker's videos as a spectator, because I didn't watch them because I hadn't read the books yet, and now that I've read the books, do I really care what anybody else thinks about the books? No, not particularly, so I may never watch them. I would have rather just enjoyed all that giddy horse whispering stuff that goes on BookTube about the Booker list as a spectator, and that's what I plan to do for book prize lists in the future, because I hate reading books that everybody else is reading and commenting on, and I'm getting tweets about what star ratings people gave to the... No, I don't want to know any of that. So that was a good learning experience. But I also realized that I'm not very much of a political person when it comes to book politics. I made a video, one of my very first videos. I don't know if it's any good, because it was one of my very early videos, was about book politics, and I don't really care about book politics for the most part. My answer, and I think the thesis of that video, my thoughts have not changed, is if people are complaining about social political issues in fiction, the only response I have is to read more books about that issue by writers from that group. And beyond that, I can't stand the controversies about books. Just not my thing. I do, and I have opinions. So I said from the very beginning that, especially after I read Damon Galgut, that it was a masterful novel, deserved to win. And what about all the black South African writers? So I'm going to read some of them next year. Stay tuned. And beyond that, I'm not going to. And I also think the Booker has actually, it's still pretty weak on writers of color, but in the last decade, it's almost 50-50 women and men. So that's, that's because a lot of people have complained about it, and great. But yeah, I just want to read books. And if I hear a bunch of people complaining about something, I will just read more of those kind of books. But beyond that, count me out. Margaret Atwood, no opinion. Well, I have opinions, but no, I don't want to... That level of bookish discourse deeply disinterests me and makes me so uncomfortable for the most part. So that's not what you're going to be hearing me talk about unless it's Indigenous issues, because I have not literary opinions. I have political opinions, and we're going to get into some of that in a minute. Well, so far the sun is cooperating. And here is the week in review. Short History of Tractors in Ukrainian is sitting on my shelf unread. Should I read it, Roz?
I don't know. Okay, first of all, that has to win the prize for the worst title ever. Because
but it's so bad that it's good. I kind of like it, but I know what you mean.
I'm so excited that I finally got to read it, because it was I think it was a haunting. It was haunting me, and it's one of the few books that sort of shattered the fourth wall for me. Like, I felt like I was reading, like I had an out-of-body experience, because you're following Ruth and Now's story, and you just get lost in it. You feel like you're all in the same room, reading, watching her write, Ruth reading the diary, and me reading Ruth. It's a very meta.
I have two bales to tell you about. My first bale of Indigathon, and I knew within about 1 minute of this audiobook that I was not going to get along with it, and that is the memoir Crazy Brave by Joy Harjo, which is her memoir written about a decade ago. And she's a poet. I'd never heard her on a podcast or on video. I didn't know anything about her poetry, and I'm still interested in her poetry, but she reads her memoir as if it's poetry. You know, the intonation that poets have at readings, it's just horrific, and it was horrific. I couldn't stand it. I don't know if I would have liked what she was reading if I was reading it textually, but I could not stand her narration, so I bailed very early on that, and have replaced it with something. I'll get to that later in this broadcast. I also bailed, as dear Roz kind of predicted, on the book from Guinea, The Radiance of the King by Camara Laye, translated from the French by James Kirkup. She said it might be too satirical for me, and I didn't ever get to the point where I realized whether it was satire or not, but I got a fifth of the way in, and I just didn't care. It was a shouty, male-centered book with all this argument and conflict and no characters that I cared about, and that is the antithesis of a Sean book. So it's very well regarded, just not by me. So those are my two bails. And I have looked high and low And there is nothing else in translation from Guinea that I am the slightest bit interested in, so we'll just move on with Invisible Cities to the next country. Stay tuned for news on that. I have finished 3 books, and I'm going to talk about the Halloween ghost story. So the 3 books that I finished couldn't be more different, one from the other, or at least one of them is quite different from the other 2. The first one is a work of nonfiction about an Indigenous issue in Canada. Invisible North, The Search for Answers on a Troubled Reserve by Alexandra Shimo. This was a buddy read with Heidi of My Reading Life, and we loved it. I have filmed my review, so if I have the energy to edit it, it will go up this weekend, but if not, it will go up very soon during the month of Indigathon, because it's one of the most important books I've read. And the fact that it was written by a settler journalist, I think, amped up the impact it had on me. There was something about a settler Canadian speaking directly to me and voicing her outrage about how Canada is such a shitty country, a human rights abuser, that it just got all the way inside me. I just found this book incredibly illuminating, and I did go to the doctor while I was still reading it, and my blood pressure was a little bit higher, and that's why Canada just makes me furious. And as I say in my review, if you read the book and you think I'm exaggerating, we need to talk. It's incredibly well written, heartrending, enraging. One of the most important books I've ever read about any topic, certainly about Indigenous issues. Let's change the topic very, very sharply here. I also finished the book about the death of Queen Victoria, which has one of the best titles of any book this year. I think I have a category for best title in my besties and worsties. Curtain Down at Her Majesty's. The Death of Queen Victoria in the Words of Those Who Were There by Stewart Richards. I really enjoyed it. And I started to say last week, or whenever I last mentioned it, that, Queen Elizabeth she's still doing well. She's doing Zoom calls. I think she's not going anywhere soon, maybe, but there was a little bit of that emotional resonance for me at the beginning, but mostly I just sank into all of the lush historical detail and the gossip, and yes, there was gossip. I am not going to describe what details the doctor shared in his diary about the condition of Queen Victoria's body. So you have to read the book to find out about that. That was interesting, I guess. But anecdotes and extraneous detail that I will take away from it more than anything else. Certainly there were portrayals of the royals, like King Edward, the new King Edward VII, that he was actually grief-stricken. I mean, there's a popular kind of thing that they hated each other, and I think in some ways they did, but that he was actually moved when his old mama died. But more things like the servants or whatever they were, I think they were part of the military that were going to move the coffin into the little, what is it called, mausoleum, where Prince Albert had been buried since 1861, and they practiced it and realized that carrying it from the church where it was into the mausoleum, it wouldn't be the right way around. Her head would be at Prince Albert's toes if they just did it the way that they should. So they had to improvise and figure out at what point could they, with as much regal ceremony, get themselves turned around so that they weren't backing it up into the mausoleum. Just stuff like that. Fascinating for me. I loved it. And last night I finished this novel for a few days late for Victober. The glare is not very good, so here it is. Esther Waters by George Moore. And I love this too. This is one of the best Victorian novels I've ever read. I think I might try to do a full review. I have a lot to say. I'll say a few things here in case I don't get to that review. Why are people not reading George Moore? Based on this, he is one of the best writers of his era. Holy smokes. And Joe, this was a buddy read with Joe Smith, and we had buddy read a short story by him, which made us look this up and read it. Apparently, nobody seems to think any of his other stuff is worth reading, or nobody's talking about it anyway. I think this might be one of the few that are easily procured, that are in print, but it's the story of a lower class woman, Esther Waters, who comes from a terrible home and is very poor and goes out for servant work and meets the wrong guy, gets knocked up, so to speak, gets pregnant, lover disappears, and it's what happens to her as a single mother in late Victorian Britain, and it was not pretty. And it is described in such an unsentimental way. In so many things about this novel felt much more modern than an 1890s novel usually feels to me. And Joe and I, we were so invested. We loved Esther so much. She had such a ferocious personality. She had a quick temper, and she was resourceful and a very sensual person and a very loving mother, and just so many facets to her personality that George, now the sun is starting to come out. I think I'll just move my body a little bit and maybe I can get a few more minutes. Okay. It was just kind of anti-Dickensian in the way that I didn't feel like I was being manipulated as a reader, and I didn't laugh at how sloppy the emotions were. It was powerful. I'm not going to say anything more about the plot, but it is a really plot-driven novel. I would say as plot-driven as it is character-driven. And, you know, George Moore was a realistic writer, so it's not like it has a particularly happy ending, and it's not like she is able to avoid the marriage plot, the cultural stuff around marriage. And so you see what happens to her when she does get married, and I'm being very non-spoilery here, and her personality does get flattened by marriage, and I don't know whether he knew what he was doing when he showed how her character got much less interesting as a married woman. But the effect of all of that together, and the way that betting on horse races is also a big part of this story, and the way that he explores class and quote-unquote class mobility and economic issues and addiction and health, consumption is a big part of the story, in such an intricate plot with such complex, interesting characters. I loved it. And yes, I did read that ghost story by one of my new favorite writers, Elizabeth Jane Howard, 3 Miles Up. It was published a couple different, I think 3 different collections, but the one that I read it in was from 3 Miles Up and Other Strange Stories, which came out from Tartarus Press in 2003, and I didn't like it. This was a buddy read with Leah and Lindy, and they liked it, but they don't have the allergy to ghost stories that I do. It wasn't even all that ghosty, but I just think supernatural fiction is so stupid. Even Elizabeth Jane Howard couldn't convince me otherwise. I just was left cold by it. Earlier this year, I read a couple books, one of which was The Promise, that had ghosts, but it was not intended to spook me. But this one was, I guess, supposed to be a super spooky thing, a Halloween story. And it's like, no, it's just so stupid. So, I am just not meant to read this stuff because I don't get it. Lindy and Leah enjoyed it far more than I, and I think they are, or maybe Leah is going to go on and finish the collection, but there isn't a ghost of a chance that I'm going to join her in that buddy read. So that's what I've finished. Most of the books I've started, other than The Bale, are going extremely well, and I am stimulated up to my collar. I've started a whole bunch. I didn't have high hopes for this one because I hadn't heard anything about the author, and I just had a feeling that so far was completely off, that this wasn't going to be very good, and this one has really captured my imagination. So The Path Does Not Die, a Sierra Leonean novel by Pede Hollist. I've looked up the pronunciation, and I believe I've got it. Pede Hollist. That is a man, and this is a book... just grabbed me by the throat. I've read the first 2 chapters only. It's just really incredible. So, the protagonist's parents lost their firstborn daughter to a botched circumcision. In other words, you really call it by its name, a female genital mutilation. Was part of the spirituality of their people. And it's set in fairly modern times. I'm not sure exactly when, but modern enough that the parents just swear off female genital mutilation, and they don't want their next born daughter to undergo it. But the paternal grandmother is very traditional, and she really wants it to happen. So there's all this familial discord about it, and she actually sneaks the daughter into wherever that torturous ritual occurs, whatever sacred building or whatever, and it's botched too, but she doesn't die. The father intervenes early enough and scoops his daughter up and gets her out of there. And then they leave town because of the outcry, because they have, first of all, that a man went into this female sacred space to interrupt this female genital mutilation ceremony, and there's such an outcry and that they leave town. And that's where I'm at. I think they're going to Freetown, which is the biggest city, the capital city, I want to say, of Sierra Leone, and that's where I'm at the story. But it's just very dramatic, and even though it's focused pretty much on this one issue, it's such a big issue, and Hollist is showing character through how the parents and the daughter feel about it, that it's really rich, and I am delighted that I chose it for the Sierra Leone category for Invisible Cities. I have started, as I'm only reading 2 books for Nonfiction November that aren't actually Indigathon nonfiction books. One of them is The Strangest Family, The Private Lives of George III, Queen Charlotte, and the Hanoverians by Janice Hadlow, and as expected, I'm absolutely loving it. I got a fairly brisk reading pace. We're doing this 700-page book over... move my head a bit again. I'm going to be sitting right on my microphone in a minute. We're reading it over 5 weeks, and she's going way back to... because George III, he took over for his grandfather, George II, and it is going back to George II's grandfather in Hanover, Germany, who, I think it was Grand Duke Ernst or something, and George I was his son, who got married to this beautiful princess, and then she had an affair with a Swiss diplomat, and somebody, they don't know who, but suddenly the Swiss diplomat disappeared. His body was never found, and so this is George III's great-grandmother, was imprisoned in a castle in Germany for the rest of her life. Could barely meet anybody after that. Okay, now it is... I gotta move, do something here. Okay, well, I've moved to the bench right beside the one I was on, and I don't know how long this one's gonna work. So please bear with me. I know some of you just particularly love my alfresco Friday reads because of all these mishaps, so I hope you're enjoying. What the hell was I talking about? So yeah, that book, The Strangest Family, is wonderful. I'm not surprised, but I am absolutely delighted by all the gossip. I have started this novel by an African-American writer, William Gardner Smith, recently reissued by NYRB. Stoneface. This is for a Zoom chat I'm going to have later in the month with Dan of the Weird Book Club, and I'm only 20 pages in. It's interesting. I don't have anything really to say. It's about the African-American guy left America because it's a racist shithole. We all know that. So is Canada. But this is set. It was published in 1963, and so it's set maybe in the 50s. And I know from what's said on the synopsis that he gets kind of mixed up with all the Algerian stuff and all the racism in France, because he kind of thought Paris would be a haven, and for African Americans it comparatively was, but then he realizes, he comes to see and somehow gets involved with the Algerian stuff. So that's all I know, and it's holding my interest, but I don't have much to say beyond that. This is a buddy read with Jay Shea. We're going to be doing 2 of these historical essays a week until the end of December, and it's also for Indigathon. On the Cusp of Contact, Gender, Space, and Race in the Colonization of British Columbia by Barman. And I'm just partway into the first essay, so I got lots of reading to do to stay on track this weekend. And the subtitle of this one is called, the first essay is called Race, Greed, and Something More, The Erasure of Urban Indigenous Space in Early 20th Century British Columbia. Just fascinating. It's really accessible writing, and I didn't know really any of the history that she is writing about, and it's how, in the context of British Columbia, they got rid of the Indians so that they could build Victoria and Vancouver. Absolutely fascinating. The second essay, which I will be getting to this weekend, is kind of following on the similar theme. It's called Erasing Indigenous Indigeneity in Vancouver. I don't know what Indigenous indigeneity is compared to indigeneity itself, but I will find out. It's a very new book. Just came out in 2020. Another big hit of Indigisathon, one that has particularly grabbed me, is the, I'm not sure what to call it, maybe memoir, Nishga by Jordan Abel, who is a Nishga Indigenous author who lives in Vancouver. And it's about intergenerational trauma for the various generations of residential schools and his very dysfunctional, violent, abusive family background, and connecting that to the fact that successive generations of his parents, grandparents, and so on learned about love and relationships by being imprisoned in residential schools. And it just grabbed me yesterday. I have no words so far, just really engrossed in it. Powerful. It has excerpts from talks he's given. I assume there's going to be some poetry in it, photographs, and all together tell this really powerful story. I didn't know anything about Jordan Abel before I read it, other than what Lindy has told me, and she will be thrilled. I know that I'm connecting very, very deeply with it so far, and I read quite a bit of it, 30% maybe. In terms of the actual prose, the one that has just bowled me over is this Native American novel, Housemaid of Dawn by N. Scott Momaday. Oh my God, the writing is so beautiful. I have put up so far only one book quote on Instagram and Twitter, and there's I could put the whole book up in a series of connected book quotes, because this man's prose is just to die for. It's set in New Mexico, and it's about some of the indigenous tribes there that I know absolutely nothing about, and I didn't know what a mesa was until this week. And what's the difference between a mesa and a butte? Did you know? Well, if you live down there, anywhere near there, you probably did, or if you're not quite so geographically inept as I am. But I'm just having a field day looking up all the words I don't know, and it's just sinking me, still on a superficial level, but it's sinking me deeper into the world that he is creating here. Oh, the grandson comes home to his grandfather, and he gets off the Greyhound bus, or whatever the bus is, he gets off the bus, and he's drunker than a skunk, and his grandfather, his very elderly grandfather, has to get him home and into bed. And then the next morning he wakes up, and he goes out, and presumably sober, and he goes out to look at the landscape where he grew up, and I guess it's going to connect his past and his present, but N. Scott Momaday, where have you been all my life? I am enthralled with this. Doris came to my rescue because I listened to about 20 minutes of that Joy Harjo memoir, and I don't want to listen to it again today. And then I watched Doris's video about the fourth quarter for the Book Naturalist Club, and they are doing the first novel of their reading throughout the year, and it is an Indigenous novel, The Seed Keeper by Diane Wilson. So I previewed the audiobook. I loved it. The narrator is Kyla Garcia. I think she might be Indigenous. The name doesn't necessarily sound like it, but she certainly has narrated a lot of Indigenous novels. And so I got the ebook, got the audiobook, and I started that morning. And I haven't gotten very far into it, but I'm quite enjoying it too. hasn't grabbed me as deeply as some of these others that I'm mentioning, but the story is very interesting, and it's also about broken families and finding a sense of family and a sense of indigenous identity coming from broken homes. All because of colonization. It's a huge issue in indigenous lives and in indigenous literature. And there's an aunt. One of the opening chapters is about an aunt who lives in an apartment, and she has a garden in her apartment, like not on her balcony even, in her apartment, in pails. She steals soil from public gardens as much as she can carry, and she has all these plants and bushes and stuff in her apartment, and it's her way of tending to her family that have disappeared. And just told in her voice, it was very moving. And again, the title is called The Seed Keeper, and I'm looking forward to seeing how the novel unfolds. So that was a late addition to my Indigathon TBR, a replacement for an audiobook that wasn't working for me at all. And so far, The Seed Keeper is starting out really good. So that's what I've started. Jeepers. I do go on, don't I? I talked for another 7 minutes about the 3 books I'll be starting this week, but who's got time for that? Here's some pretty covers to look at instead.